Welcome to episode 77 of the Half Point Per Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Riggs, joined as always by my co-host, Dalton Willie. Our producer, Johnny Pham, is out on a scouting assignment in Minnesota. Took a little KJ Osborne, Irv Smith, Kirk Cousins stack in best ball in our draft late. So I sent Johnny out there to get the lowdown on that. He'll be back next week. Dalton, how are you tonight?
I am doing good. Tomorrow we are exactly 1 month away from what is a really great Thursday night football matchup in the Bills Rams. So probably tops Bucks Dallas last year. So it's going to be an exciting start to the season. I played some DFS last weekend for the Hall of Fame game. I bet some unders in that game. I hit money. If you're not following me on Twitter for some of the immortal locks in these preseason games, then you're just missing out because this is where the money's made, baby.
All I know is I am happy to report that I was the only one in the podcast group chat that did not turn on that game, as you and Johnny were getting a little bit upset about potential point totals that were being hit or not hit as the night went on.
Okay, well, the fact that the Raiders came out and let Josh Jacobs play like a solid 3 drives was very concerning for a lot of the bets I
had. Potentially concerning for a lot of reasons, but that's also a lot of narrative street won't quite jump down yet. We'll see if anything concrete.
Too late for some of us.
That is factual. But something that is concrete, Dalton, is J.K. Dobbins is back on the practice field for the first time in over a year when he hurt his knee on astronomically terrible turf. J.K. Dobbins has been activated off the PUP. He is on track for week 1. I will say the one video I've seen of him that I share with you guys, he looks like he has some work to do before week 1. But you said it. We are basically a month away, so still a lot of time. But just overall encouraging that Dobbins is off the PUP and seemingly on track, it seems, to play week 1.
Yeah, and still a screaming value where he's at. I mean, I think he's getting drafted as the RB23. I'm assuming that's going up with him coming off the PUP. But with the news about Gus Edwards, we have ourselves like a little bit of a situation where Dobbins could, maybe get a higher backfield share and a higher rush percentage in the highest rushing offense in the NFL with Lamar Jackson. I mean, there's really sky-high upside here, and he's being priced so low. There's just so much. I mean, him and Miles Sanders are getting drafted together, and one of those players is not that good, and the other player was very good when we saw him in action 2 years ago.
Yep, I agree. And, I haven't even mentioned, but the main topic of today's show, if you're here from Twitter or you're listening on the pod, you obviously see, but we've got sleepers, we've got breakouts this week. And I had to think really hard about putting J.K. Dobbins on the breakout list because, as you know, he was a my guy for me last year and was the preeminent my guy on my whole list of my guys. I loved J.K. Dobbins. I just still have hesitation putting a guy 1 year removed off of ACL surgery on a breakout list, but you are right that if he is healthy and if the Gus Edwards thing is still slow going, which it is right now, that it's setting up well for Dobbins if he's able to play right away to start the season. And if he is just back to himself, then we have a very, very major value on our hands. I always want to ask you, what does a screaming value sound like? What is it yelling at you when you see it in the draft?
Sounds like Allen Robinson in the 4th round right now.
Fair enough. A guy that might be turning might have been a value at one point, now looking like less of a value as we go along here. Treylon Burks, he is apparently working through some serious learning curves, which is not surprising. He's worked with the 2s and 3s a bit in camp, which, again, like a lot of these guys probably do and go back and forth. So I'm not reading too much into it, but it's at least a notable thing. Like we said, we were going to be paying attention to pretty much every Treylon Burks headline over the next month, a couple weeks ago, and I still am, but there's still a lot of time between now and draft season, but just something else to keep in your back pocket as we move forward here.
Yeah, well, and we were notable Treylon Burks faders at the start. If you've listened to us, you don't have any shares of him. I would say,
although Johnny, who is our producer, actually does have a share of him, so a little ironic there.
I would say my concern is, one, Mike Vrabel put Julio Jones in the doghouse last year for doing some wrong things, and that's Julio Jones.
Well, and I actually was listening to Chris Harris, talk about Burks the other day, and he made the comment, well, AJ Brown kind of got benched midway through his rookie season and didn't really break out and become every week type of starter until late in the year. So even AJ Brown, who's an awesome receiver, got benched by Vrabel. So it would not be a shock at all to see Burks get benched at some point during the season.
Yeah. Well, my other concern is like normally when you have a rookie running with the twos and threes, you're like, oh, they're a rookie. It's where they should be at. But on the other side of the ball, Kyle Phillips is like running all camp with the run ones.
Yep.
And I mean, I think he's their 5th round pick. It's not like they invest a lot in him. It is a little concerning to see that one guy is picking up the game a lot differently than the other. Not to mention Treylon Burks. I mean, the asthma to start the season, whatever that was, he was out of shape, misconditioned. Just it's been a horrendous start for him for his NFL career.
I will say the difference between Burks and Phillips is Burks comes in as a completely unrefined football player, whereas that is how Kyle Phillips even got drafted, is that he's a super refined player. He's a guy that I think before the draft was someone that people identified as he doesn't have a ton of upside, but he could potentially be a slot receiver because he just kind of knows how to play the receiver position. Whereas Burks,
Absolutely.
he doesn't run too many routes right now, and he's going to take time. And I'm glad that you brought up that we weren't major backers of him to start the whole draft process back in April, because I've seen people compare this to the Jamar Chase football thing last year, where it's like, well, Burks was a prospect that had his major fans and detractors, very polarizing, whereas Jamar Chase was widely seen as a generational prospect before the draft. He skipped a whole year of college football and still went, pick 4, pick 5, whatever it was. So this is a different level of prospect in Treylon Burks compared
Yeah,
to.
well, and Jamar Chase caught balls all over the field, not within 10 yards like Treylon Burks did. No offense to him, but Treylon Burks won on athleticism, not on being a good wide receiver. And it's just harder to translate being a good wide receiver. Everybody in the NFL is an athlete. Not everybody in the NFL can get the technical skills in, and some guys make their careers out of that, which is the biggest concern with Treylon Burks, obviously, is that he'll never turn those into that. Still rooting for the guy, but I wouldn't recommend you draft him. There's another receiver in Robert Woods I'd probably take every day over him.
I'm probably with you at this point, but still a ways to go. Geno Smith is apparently starting the first preseason game for Seattle, and in the blurb where I read this, the blurb surmises that he seems to have a solid leg up on the QB1 spot, which I know Drew Lock isn't good, but I still think it'd be slightly better if Drew Lock were the starter than DK Metcalf. So it's going to be bad regardless in Seattle, but just worth noting that Geno Smith could actually be the starter, at least to begin the season.
Well, it's funny because I was listening to the Ringers football show. I'm sorry, not the Ringer, the Athletics football show. And Robert Mays was saying that everybody was telling him Drew Lock has the upper hand. And this is just one of those like beat street things where like I remember, what was it, a week ago? It was Melvin Gordon's 80-20 split, and someone else reported Javonte was 99-1 split. Like it's just absurd. Regardless, I mean, I don't really care who starts here. I just don't kind of want something to do with Tyler Lockett just because of how cheap he is. But like the quarterbacking on this team, the offensive line play, and the coaching staff are just so horrendous that fantasy wise, it is so hard for me to get excited about anybody here.
I'm starting to think that Noah Fant was lying when he said that Drew Lock was having some Patrick Mahomes like throws in training camp if Geno Smith is starting the first preseason game.
Well, he was probably talking about like Patrick Mahomes in the Super Bowl when he was getting sacked repeatedly by the Tampa Bay Bucks. That's the only way I could think of it.
You mentioned Melvin Gordon. I didn't have this in the notes, but I guess it is at least worth mentioning that the Broncos said today that Gordon is nursing a foot injury, so they're kind of giving him some rest. Worth watching, but I think this was his first missed practice, so it's still like it could just be a Veterans Day off. We've got plenty of time to the season, but just be watching his health going forward, I guess, is really the only thing I would say there.
Yeah, and I mean, they did sign 2 running backs who are probably going to get cut by the start of the season, so I'm a little anxious about it, but I'm not too concerned until we hear more about the foot injury.
I will agree with Todd that maybe Drew Lock is better than he's been given credit for by Dalton, because he's not literally the worst quarterback, but he's close.
He's close.
Very close. Okay, Dalton, we'll go from arguably the worst to one of the best in Josh Allen. That's where we're going to start our player props today. So, Josh Allen, his over-under for passing yards is at 4,320.5. Are you taking the over or the under on Josh Allen's total here?
Yeah, I was a little confused about how low this was. He's hit the over mark last 2 seasons, one of those seasons being a 16-game season. Um, what really stands out to me about the Buffalo Bills is last year they played the NFL's easiest schedule. So there were a lot of layup games for Josh Allen and co. where they didn't really have to, go all out and pass the ball. In pass rate over expectation last year, they were only 12th in the NFL. And we know the reason for that is because they led so often and their defense looked strong doing it. They're going to play a harder schedule. They're going to have to air it out more. And undoubtedly, I think that leads to them passing it more.
Noah asked Drew Lock or Sam Darnold in the chat. Neither. I'm taking the over here as well. You mentioned he's hit that number the last 2 years. He has. It was less comfortable last year in a full 17-game slate. But the one thing you like about any of these AFC quarterbacks numbers, although Herbert's is pretty high, but any of the others, you have to assume they all have to play 17 games, because the AFC is going to be so tough, and it is going to be a bloodbath to get to the playoffs. I'd be shocked if there's anyone who can rest in week 18. People are going to be fighting for home field, fighting for seeds, whatever, all season long. We've talked about a little bit the loss of Dabble, but they have Ken Dorsey as offensive coordinator, who has already been there, and I think is set up to be a really good offensive coordinator based on things I've read in the last couple of days. A lot of people seem to have big-time faith in him. So, Josh Allen's still young. He's still an ascending player. His completion percentage dipped down to 63% last year, which was still his second best season after it being at 69 the year before. So if he just ups that efficiency a little bit to somewhere in between, he should comfortably hit this number, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe even with Gabriel Davis, that passing offense is a little better than it was last year. And
James Cook getting involved.
James Cook, we will see about that one. We will see.
Cam Akers, I called him maybe the biggest swing player in fantasy football in the Rams and Cardinals preview that came out on the newsletter today, which you can find on halfpointperpod.substack.com. His rushing prop is 849.5. Dalton, I'm taking the over. I feel absolutely sick about it, but we both have him as a top 20 guy. You right at 20 and me at 18. He has 25 receptions for 260 yards in 20 games in his entire career. If he is going to be a top 20 guy, it's got to be on the ground, I think. Darrell Henderson, if he's healthy, profiles as the pass catcher of the two. Akers did catch the ball a little bit more in the playoffs last year than he ever had really previously in his career, like more consistently. But he really doesn't have to have that inspiring of a season to hit this number if he can stay relatively healthy. Sony Michel was 4 yards under this number last year. David Montgomery was 3 yards under, and he missed a month of the season. Devin Singletary hit this number. We've talked about how the only reason he was a top 30 back was because he played every game last year. So I think if you count on the fact that he's going to have to make his money on the ground this year, and we both seem to have faith that he can maybe do that, although he's a tough rank in the top 20. It's a big time swing for sure, and it just really is about staying healthy and looking better than he looked last postseason. But I think he's got it in him.
Wow, this is such a swing from last year where I yelled on the podcast about Cam Akers being a screaming amazing player because I'm taking the under. And Cam Akers is probably like the player I'm the most concerned about being wrong about, because if he is healthy post Achilles, he's going to hit. He's going to hit really well. I mean, he was a top 12 pick in fantasy drafts before the Achilles injury last year. For some people, not for you. The Rams love to run the ball. My concerns are the loss of Whitworth. That offensive line's a little shakier. That one-on-one talk about him and Darrell Henderson splitting work, I think Darrell Henderson probably catches balls, doesn't rush a lot. But
Can
even
I just
then,
can I just say I just flat out like Sean McVay is one of the biggest liars on the face of the planet. I just don't buy that at all. Cam Akers was coming back from a torn Achilles in less than 7 months and was the guy in the playoffs last year. And we were all kind of like, "Are you sure you don't want to give the ball to Sony Michel a little bit?" So I think if Akers is somewhere close to right, he's going to be the #1 guy.
yeah, but what if he's close to wrong, which I
It's
think he might
possible.
be?
It's
I mean,
possible.
would you be shocked if Cam Akers was like sixth in the NFL in rushing yards? Or sorry,
Literally,
no, sorry, sixth in the NFL in rush attempts and like 12th in rushing yards.
literally
Just because,
nothing. Literally nothing would shock me. He could come back and be terribly inefficient because that's what we saw in the playoffs last year. But I mentioned this in the newsletter. If he never came back last year in the playoffs, if we just knew he was close but never came back, is his ADP higher? Because the last vision we have of him in our minds is getting like 2.5 yards per carry in the Super Bowl on like 18 carries in that
yeah,
game. And like guys don't come back from torn Achilles, period, sometimes. And he came back in such a short amount of time. So should we be holding that against him? But also, it's hard not to because we just don't know if he's going to ever be back. So it's so tough. He has the widest range of outcomes. He and Gabe Davis are the two for me. And I could see Cam Akers being awesome. I could see him being terrible next year. I could see really anything.
yeah. I just can't do it. I don't want any part of him. I just want to watch and see, and I'll cheer for him and maybe play him in DFS if he gets good again.
Fair enough. James Conner, his line for rushing touchdowns, this was a guy who had quite a few of them last year, is 8.5. Dalton, are you on the over or the under here?
Yeah, I'm just taking the under. James Conner is one of those guys that just scores touchdowns, but he's also one of those guys that like just gets hurt a
Yeah.
lot. So that's a concern for me. Secondly, I went and looked it up. All but 2 of his touchdowns last season came within the 5-yard line. There is a little bit of NFL luck required to get in those situations where the wide receiver goes out at the 2 and then you get the ball. And that's what happens with him.
Yeah.
But you need that to happen more frequently. And Kyler Murray is one of the best downfield passers. So this could be one of those teams, just like Kansas City is, where they're not like a great red zone team because so frequently they're scoring outside the 20s.
Yep.
So I can see that as a really high range of outcomes for him. And I mean, 9 touchdowns for running back is just hard to get to. It's hard. So I'm definitely taking the under on this one.
He had 15 last year, which is just crazy. He had 15 rushing touchdowns. And again, Cardinals were a feature point in the most recent newsletter. I think it was like 15 rushing touchdowns and 700 and something rushing yards, which is just an absurd split. You like 15 rushing touchdowns is crazy. It's even crazier to not even be sniffing 1,000 rushing yards, which I think he actually probably will rush for more yards if he's healthy this year than he did last year because Chase Edmonds is gone. But you mentioned the inside the 5 stuff. He was second in rush attempts inside the 5 last year. He would be first most years, but Jonathan Taylor had a quite literally historic workload inside the 5-yard line last year. Look back to 2020 when Dalvin Cook and Zeke were the 2 leaders, and James Conner had 4 more than either of those guys in 2021 than they had in 2020. So just to give some context there, they bring in Darrell Williams, who I'm not saying he's great. I'm not saying he's going to like threaten Conner for the job, but he was tied for 3rd in carries inside the 5-yard line last year for the Chiefs. He could potentially get some of that short yardage work if they want to spare Conner some of that punishment. He's definitely built for that and is a short yardage back that they should be able to trust. And they didn't have that guy last year because there was Chase Edmonds, who quite famously is a between the 20s running back that never gets carries inside the 10-yard line. And then Kyler had like 4 rushing touchdowns last year, which is a career low. So maybe his number comes up too. There's a lot of things that went Conner's way perfectly last year that I don't think it's going to happen this year. I know 8.5 is a lot lower than 15, but 8.5 is still a big number. It just doesn't feel like it because of how big the number was last year.
Yeah, well, it's just like we talked about with Cooper Kupp. I mean, those numbers are so astronomically high; they have to come down. Connor was second in the NFL in rush TDs, wasn't he? He was only beaten out by JT. I'm pretty sure.
I think so. And that I don't even remember what Jonathan Taylor's total number was, but he had like 4 or 5 in one game. So maybe if Taylor doesn't have that game, it would have been even. And he had like double the yards. So again, just craziness from James Conner last year. Jalen Hurts. I did in fact put this on here so we could yell at each other because I'm sure we have opposite answers here. Over or
Oh my
under his
God.
passing yardage prop of 3,450 and a half. Also, just a little side note, his passing touchdowns are at 22 and a half, if that is of interest to anybody. Dalton, are you taking the over or the under here?
Well, I can't believe you're taking the under because that's already clear. I'm taking the over. A couple of things here.
He didn't do it. He's never done it before. So
He was 300 off last year, didn't play a game, and walked out of the second game against the Lions because he got injured. So there's 2 games for him to get 150 passing yards. And he just got A.J. Brown added to this offense. I am famously in the camp that the Eagles return to their weeks 1 through 7 form because they want to throw the ball because Nick Sirianni knows throwing the ball is the way they play. Just out of curiosity, I'm not comparing them at all as passers, but ever since he's had A.J. Brown, Ryan Tannehill has gone over this number. And I am not going to go out on a limb and say it's not going to be incredibly hard for him to throw the ball to A.J. Brown at the 5 and let A.J. Brown run it for 30 yards. And he hits this number. I think last season, if he has A.J. Brown all season, he probably hits the over on this number.
It's close for me. I mean, it's not like this is a no-brainer under because it's not a very high number, but he was under it by a fair amount last year. Do you say if he played a full season? I think the thing I worry about with him, maybe more than you, his play style, and he basically plays like Josh Allen, like takes the type of hits that Josh Allen takes, maybe even more, honestly, than Josh Allen, but he's 15 pounds lighter and about 5 or 6 inches shorter than Josh Allen. So I think he's going to be a quarterback that profiles to miss some games every year. You'd feel pretty lucky, I think, if you got a full season out for Hurts, which maybe you do. And if you do, you have a good chance of this number. But that's part of my concern as well. You mentioned weeks 1 through 7, and I am so glad you did because I went back and took a very close look. I didn't include week 7. I don't remember why, but it was weeks 1. I think
week 7 is specifically the week they turned to a run-heavy team. So 1 through 6, you're correct.
I specifically was on the hunt for garbage time stats because I was just curious because, if you Google or Twitter search Jalen Hurts garbage time or DeAndre Swift garbage time, all you get is people talking about it all September and all October last year. I was like, okay, let me go back and see if I can find if it was as garbage time heavy as I remember. Last year, weeks 1 through 6, he threw for almost half of his yards on the whole season in those first 6 weeks. And that was 40% of the games he played. So his passing was definitely more productive those first 6 games. With his team ahead, he threw for 350 yards. With his team tied, he threw for 146. That means he threw for 1,220 yards with his team behind, and he had the lowest QB rating of any of those numbers, which I thought was kind of weird because he threw for a ton of yards, but maybe he had some picks. But the one game that I went back and looked at in particular, because everybody remembers this game. Everybody remembers the Cowboys game where he threw the pick 6. They got down big. He threw the touchdown with like 10 seconds left. That was a good throw, but like the play where he's running towards the sideline, you know what I'm talking about, and throws it, I think, to Greg Ward in the end zone. Yeah. It was like, congrats, there's 5 seconds left and you score a touchdown. And they did the same thing the next week against the Chiefs too. But they're down 27-7 early third quarter, and it was never closer than 2 possessions after that. He had 229 of his 326 passing yards from that point on in that game. And then the Chiefs game next week, it wasn't quite as profound, but it was still like 100 to 115. I don't remember the exact number passing yards when they were down by multiple scores. I say all this to say that if they are actually a better team this year, some of that, even if they do throw the ball more, some of that garbage time stuff where he really racked up stats earlier in the season, he may actually have less yards, but be a better quarterback, be playing more efficiently, making fewer mistakes, and he just doesn't hit that total because I still think they're going to run more than you think. So I'm not like trying to completely hate on Jalen Hurts with the under here, but I just, even though it's not that big of a number, it just makes me nervous.
A couple of things I'll say. First, Taylor Heineke almost hit the over on this number, which was really my determining factor for picking it because I do think Jalen Hurts can be a better passer than Taylor Heineke. Which I know is not saying a lot for anything. The second thing I'll say is if you go back 3 years ago, you could probably like do the same armchair analysis of like when Josh Allen got his yards, which was probably a lot of it in garbage time.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. And the only thing with the Josh Allen comp is that Josh Allen made like one of the biggest improvements I've seen in my life.
And I'll never say that like Jalen Hurts is going to get that But I will say part of Josh Allen becoming a better quarterback and part of anybody becoming a better quarterback is getting an all-star wide receiver.
Yeah.
And Jalen Hurts definitely got that, which is really why I chose the over. It's just the addition of A.J. Brown. I'd probably be a lot more bearish on Jalen Hurts this season if they didn't go out and add, who I think is a top 12 wide receiver in the NFL.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious your thoughts on this take I heard this week, and then we'll move on. I heard somebody say this week on a podcast that, and this wasn't even a guy that's a Jalen Hurts hater. He's actually an Eagles fan. So he doesn't hate Jalen Hurts.
Trust me, if you search Jalen Hurts, there are plenty of Eagles fans who also hate him.
Well, his question was basically, why would I draft Jalen Hurts at his ADP, which is like top 7 quarterback, when I could just take the same guy with probably more talent in Trey Lance and just hope that it. I'm just curious what you think about that take of taking Hurts at his ADP versus just waiting for Lance and shooting for that rushing upside.
I think we should just wait for my last breakout to talk about that one. Because
all right,
that is word for word something I wrote down, which was as much as I love Jalen Hurts, I would probably take Trey Lance at QB 13 over Jalen Hurts.
Okay, well, we'll get to that then. I wish I would have teased that later. That would have been perfect. Man. All right, our fifth and final guy here, Juju Smith-Schuster. His over-under for receiving yards is set at 750.5. Dalton, I put this one on here because I felt like I needed a layup this week, and I really feel like that this one is 750.5. I mean, I'm taking the over, or I'm assuming you are, but.
Oh, no, I'm taking the under. Juju gets hurt week 1. No, I'm taking the over. If you, and I know anybody who's not a Chiefs fan isn't paying as close attention as you and I, but if you listen to the people who really matter in the Chiefs beat reporters camp, it is like Juju's room. Juju is the wide receiver, and then there's everybody else. I love Sky Moore. I like MVS and Mecole, but it is like really Juju's job to lose. And for 2 years, any Chiefs fan who's watched Mahomes play has said Mahomes needs a Juju, which is a short to intermediate guy who beats zone coverages so we can play some deeper balls. And it's just going to work out. I believe it. We're 3 years removed from this guy playing with the best Big Ben in the last 3 years and having 1,500 yards and being like a wide receiver 2 as far as Dynasty ADP goes.
I think he was actually like the number 1 overall player for Dynasty at one point. I hear people mention that all the time with him.
Which is a death nail because so is Michael Thomas.
I'm taking the over, obviously, too. You mentioned they need a possession receiver. They obviously have that in Kelsey. And the great thing about having that in Kelsey is that Juju's never going to get the linebacker help his way because they're going to let him eat and try and take away Kelsey as much as possible in that area of the field. 3 of the 4 seasons, the full seasons he's played, I put full in quotations, air quotes, because he only played 12 games in the other full year. He's hit that number. And even in that year he played 12 games, which was also his worst statistical year from a per game standpoint, he still would have hit that number if he played every game, which you can't predict anyone's going to do that. I think he's going to be closer to 1,000 yards than this number, quite frankly. He's going to be the top receiver in this offense. Sure, it's not going to be the same gap from him to the next guy as Tyreek Hill to the next guy, but he's still going to be the number 1 receiver, not counting Kelsey. In this offense, I think he hits this number easily with good health.
Yeah, and we don't both rank him inside our top 20 if we don't expect 1,000 yards. I mean, you almost have to hit that as a receiver or have an insane touchdown number to be in the top 20, which, again, I really think that there's some massive, recency bias going on with Juju. Granted, he's not an alpha wide receiver 1, but you can be a fine wide receiver 1 with the best quarterback in the NFL for fantasy purposes. Guys have done it before. Devontae Parker put up a wide receiver 8 season 3 years ago with Fitzpatrick. So let's not act like you have to be an alpha to do it.
Boy, I would love to forget that Devontae Parker season ever happened. Okay, Dalton. Let's get to the meat of this show, and that is the sleepers and the breakouts. We'll start with the sleepers, and we'll end big with the bigger names for breakout players. And I'll start us off here. I've got a pair of rookies in the sleeper category, which I usually don't do, but these guys both just jump out to me as great values, even though I have never seen them play an NFL football game. I'm just a big believer. The first guy being Jahan Dotson. Now, I know neither of us were the biggest Jahan Dotson fan as far as first round receiver. That's because I don't think this guy's going to have superstar upside. But what I do think though is he has every tool you need at receiver to come in and contribute right away. He has great hands. The reports all offseason with him have been great. And in contrast, you have Curtis Samuel, who I don't think can even be tackled in training camp right now because they're trying to nurse him back from injuries and keep him from getting injured again. You have Dimey Brown, who, bless his heart, love the guy, but missed all of last week with a leg injury and just kind of seems to be there, has been second string, not really much of a factor. It doesn't seem like in any of the stuff that I've seen come out of Washington these last couple of months. He has probably the best hands in his class. He's got great speed. He knows how to get open. He grades very well on reception perception. He has an 81% contested catch rate. The Matt Harmon comparison he gives him is Doug Baldwin in the slot. Not saying he's going to be that, and especially not this year, but this is a guy that's 96th percentile in separation against zone coverage. He is going to be a reliable weapon for Carson Wentz from day one, someone that gets open very quickly and is, I think, the security blanket for Carson Wentz this year.
Yeah, and I agree with you. A big thing that helps determine wide receiver breakouts, and it's not something that's really fun to talk about if you're a fantasy analyst, is draft capital teams are investing in players because they want those players to work out, and those players are going to get more opportunities to work out, and in fantasy, opportunities are king. More importantly, this team has not had a consistent slot guy for 2 seasons. Curtis Samuel was brought in last year to do that. In replace of that, it's been like the J.D. McKissick show, where there are games where J.D. McKissick has had 10 receptions because their slot guys aren't good. 2 seasons ago, who was the KU player we were hyping up who played for the Washington football team?
Was it Steven Sims?
Yeah, it was Steven Sims playing the slot role, and he had a 6-reception game because they were just so bereft of talent outside of Terry McLaurin. Jahan Dotson, for all of the misgivings, and we weren't high on him, but when a team takes him that high and a team has a really specific role they need for him, it's something you really need. I'm always concerned about tying anybody to Carson Wentz at this point, but he is so cheap in drafts that
wide receiver 65 on Fantasy Pros right now.
Yeah. And it is a little absurd that guys who are drafted after him, like Sky Moore and Christian Watson, have such a different draft ADP right now. I understand the situations they're in, but those guys don't even necessarily have to come out and produce right away to return their value when Washington is expecting Jahan Dotson out there.
And don't get me wrong, I've been one of the biggest Jameson Williams stands as a prospect for the last year, 9 months now, but he's going 3 spots ahead of him in wide receiver ADP ahead of Jahan Dotson. Last we heard, it seems at least possible that Jameson Williams is not back until November, and he is coming back to the Detroit Lions. He's not coming back to the Chiefs, to the Packers, to a great situation. So I like Williams long term. I think it's insane that he's going a couple spots ahead of Dotson right now, and if the health stuff keeps trending the way it is, that won't keep happening, but it should not be happening right now.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if after week 1, Dotson was the number 1 waiver wire pickup after whatever fantasy running back comes off of nowhere and pulls an Elijah Mitchell all over again. If he was the number 1 guy that we were telling people to target after week 1, when he has 8 targets and 5 catches for 80 yards.
Yep, I could definitely see it. Dalton, who's your first sleeper?
We can just rewind the tape from last year because we're running this guy back because last year it just didn't work out. But it's Brandon Ayuk. I didn't even want to name him a sleeper because last year he was going at the 3-4 turn in fantasy drafts. But I went and looked it up, and he's wide receiver 41 overall, going 100th off the board. Just for clarification, he finished the season as the wide receiver 36. It is incredibly insane to me that
and he was a top 24 receiver the last 8 weeks or something.
Exactly. And we'll get to that, which weeks 1 through 7, he sucked. For fantasy purposes, he completely sucked. He averaged 2.7 targets a game, 16 yards, and 0.2 touchdowns.
The good thing is he really only burned you one time, because in week 1 you played him, he literally did nothing, and you're like, okay, he played like 5 snaps. I cannot play this guy again until he does something. So there have been more harmful busts to your fantasy team than he was last year.
Well, and then you just jump from weeks 8 all the way through the NFC Championship game, because when a team's using a player in the playoffs, it probably means they want to continue to use them in the regular season. He was averaging 5.9 targets a game, 4 catches, 61 yards, and 11.9 PPR points per game. So he was like a bona fide top 12 wide receiver. He was a consistent option in a good offense. And this is like one of the few wide receivers where he is one injury away from a full-time role. And the 2 guys in his way are George Kittle and Deebo Samuel, which we know those guys have injury problems. I went and was reading The Athletic. All of their beat reporters are saying that Brandon Ayuk is the star of camp. Him and Trey Lance are connecting on everything. And that fits a lot, because if you read reception perception, Matt Harmon pretty much lays it out that Brandon Ayuk and Trey Lance's skill sets merge perfectly, and Deebo Samuel's and Jimmy Garoppolo's skill sets merge perfectly, which Jimmy G is a short to intermediate passer for slant routes. That's like all Deebo was running last year, not to be offensive to him. In the meantime, Ayuk was playing the true X role, and with the shoulder injury Jimmy Garoppolo had, he was just refusing to throw it downfield. So there was just a lot of useless routes run by Brandon Ayuk. And I mean, I know he had an amazing season, but we were ranking like Ayuk 2 full rounds ahead of Deebo last year.
Yeah.
And
I think that ship is definitely sailed, though. No one's doing that.
Absolutely. But it wasn't for nothing. And now it's like he's a forgotten afterthought in an offense that's going to change drastically, and I think favors the skill set of him. And I think it's just a layup in fantasy to take him every time you can.
Yeah, so on Fantasy Pros, he is 98 overall, wide receiver 39, so a little bit higher, but not much. And it's weird. There's been the Ayuk drumbeat for the last week or so, and his ADP really hasn't moved a whole lot since then. It's funny. I was thinking about who I wanted to put on my breakouts list. Went and looked at who I put last year. I have one repeat, and the second one was Brandon Ayuk, and I really wanted to put him on there, but I was like, no, I think Ayuk, he's probably the number 1 post-hype sleeper in fantasy football. And I think for a lot of the reasons that you said, Trey Lance has the huge arm, will throw it down the field. Ayuk, as Matt Harmon has pointed out, he just knows how to get open on basically every level of the field. And he's not Deebo Samuel, but people do kind of forget how awesome he is with the ball in his hands too.
He was a first-round pick.
He was a first-round pick, and he had the Deebo Samuel comp as far as what he does with the ball. Like, I still remember one of his first games as a rookie where he had the touchdown where he like jumped over the guy.
Yes. We showed that last year on the pod when we were hyping him up.
Yeah. I'm sure we did. Like, Ayuk is awesome, and if I don't have to take him to be a fantasy starter, then I'm totally in on that, because there's definitely upside. And even if he only does what he did last year, but the ride is smoother, then it will be a major boom for your team.
Well, and just the one thing I can't make sense for me is Devonta Smith is going 7 spots in wide receiver ADP ahead of Brandon Ayuk, when Devonta Smith is behind Dallas Goedert and behind A.J. Brown, just like Ayuk is behind Deebo and behind Kittle. And both of them are in 2 very run-heavy offenses, or what fantasy people think will be run-heavy offenses. But Ayuk's just better. I mean, no offense to Smith, but it's just a better player right now. And he's in his 3rd year versus 2nd year. I don't understand that one at all. I'm really having a hard time wrapping my head around that one.
I would also argue that Devonta Smith was majorly held back by his quarterback last year, because if there's one thing that Hurts isn't going to do, it's the timing stuff on like the intermediate routes, which is where Devonta Smith kind of lives. So, but that's another argument for Ayuk, obviously, too, is that he actually does fit very well with his quarterback, whereas I think Devonta Smith needs an actual pure passer to really unlock what he is as a route runner.
It's sneaky what you did there. You're getting me to agree with you, but you're also hating on Jalen Hurts.
Okay, so we know you have Trey Lance later. You have Brandon Ayuk now. What could possibly go wrong with 2 Niners on on this list. We will find out.
Oh, Trey Sermon's on here too. No.
Please, God. Okay. My second guy is a guy that we have both been pounding the drum for all off season, all draft season, and that's Chris Olave. Right now, he's the wide receiver 46. I looked at my ranks a little bit further again today, moved him up a couple spots to wide receiver 34. It's really tough to get him higher than that, but I still really want to. I think he's going to be a flat out star in the NFL, and he's kind of like Dotson, where he has the tools that translate right away to being a good player from day one in the NFL, but he also just has more upside as a player and a prospect than Dotson does. Best route runner in the class by far. You've mentioned this exact note from Matt Harmon on reception perception in the past. I'm just going to bring it up again. He's right there with Devonta Smith in success rate against man coverage in their last years of college. That's one of the best in reception perception history. And he's better than Jalen Waddle against zone coverage in his last year in college too. He's also in the 93rd percentile against press man coverage, which if you're an X receiver, that's a very important thing for you to be good at. He's a great ball tracker, a great contested catch guy, which you wouldn't think that at his size, but he had like an 81% contested catch rate, right up there with Drake London as the top rookie in the class last year. I honestly, and I'm not doing this while taking a dig at Michael Thomas like you are every time you talk up Olave, but I think it's not outside of the realm of possibility that this is a top 15 to 20 receiver. I would not like the full Odell, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase boom, but like very high end wide receiver 2, or at least a solid wide receiver 2 type of boom that he could have this year. The comp I've seen for him a lot is Calvin Ridley, and Ridley is a good example because he, I think, was very polished, ready to play right away. Came in, was top 30 guy right away. I think Olave has a great chance to do that, and he can even do more because of just how awesome he is, quite frankly.
Yeah, what's funny is I remember about a time last year, this time around, we both really loved an Ohio State rookie. We were both in lockstep about the skill set, about him being amazing for the team. And then he ended up not being worth a roster spot on your team in the name Trey Sermon. But I completely agree with you. The skill set is there. I'm going to take this opportunity to bash Michael Thomas a little more. I absolutely hate that, like, we get on Twitter and people are like, look at Michael Thomas running these routes by himself on the side of the field. It's like, congratulations, like you've cleared the very, very lowest bar you possibly can for a guy we haven't seen play football for 2 years. I think the fantasy community would be a lot more behind Chris Olave if he didn't play in such a crowded wide receiver room at Ohio State. I mean, Jackson Smith and Nick Jigba is probably a top 15 pick next year.
Yeah.
Garrett
and he's
Wilson,
like one of the favorites to win the Heisman Trophy in college football this year.
And he probably is going to win the Blinkrichoff Award. And then we have Garrett Wilson, who is a top 4 pick or top 8 pick in the draft this year. He's the first wide receiver off the board.
I think he was number 10 overall. Drake London 8, and then Garrett Wilson 10.
Yeah, there I flipped their numbers. I mean, if he was in an offense like Treylon Burks was, where he was the guy, it would be a significantly different conversation around him. He's attached to a better quarterback than some of these other rookies are. I mean, for instance, just Jahan Dotson. No offense to him and your other sleeper, but I mean, I believe it. I think he's going to be a top 30 guy. Like you said, every time I look at my rankings, I'm like, I want to move him up, but then I'm like, well, do I move Cortland Sutton down? Who do I move down? That's right in front of him, and it's really difficult. But the more you look at it, the more I like it. And the last thing I'll say about this is I really don't want to like the Saints this year for a ton of reasons. But the more I listen to like non-fantasy people talk about them, I think they're going to be like a legitimately good team, like well put together and well coached, which you want to invest on those teams and not complete, teams that are falling apart like the Jaguars and the Texans. And that makes me want more of Olave, which also really concerns me going forward because I take him in every underdog draft. I'm 80% exposed to him, and I think I have over $100 invested in Chris Olave being a legitimate NFL product.
I think anybody who wanted to make the argument against Olave, outside of any argument against him as a player, which I think we could shut down pretty quickly, the argument is, well, the Saints did not let Jameis throw at all last year. I think the Saints receivers were like the second lowest in the NFL in receptions last year, with the Eagles being the lowest. My response to that would be look at their receivers last year. It was Marquez Callaway, Lil Jordan Humphrey,
Well, and
Taysom Hill catching passes and throwing the ball, like Adam Troutman, the
and
ghost of
collectively we tried to make Traycon Smith a thing as a
yeah,
fantasy community. Like
and so,
that didn't happen.
and they have Michael Thomas back. Even if they don't, Olave is awesome. Jarvis Landry is a good pro still at this point. So that receiver room goes from 0 to pretty good overnight, essentially. So it's not going to be Tampa Bay Jameis, where he throws for 5,000 yards and loses the job, but I think we're going to see them open it up a little bit more, because why would you trade up multiple first-round picks for Chris Olave to just not let your quarterback throw it to him? I know it's only 1 year. You have him for longer than that, but like, why would you do that if you're not going to truly try and use the guy?
Yeah, well, and then I think there's a lot of talk just going around. They don't want Alvin Kamara to have to catch 80 balls again, just because of his age and the investment the organization has made in him. So I think that there's only positive things that could happen with Chris Olave in fantasy. So I'm very concerned about what the negatives are going to be on week 1.
I think they play the Falcons week 1, so I think it'll be a pretty positive week 1 experience. That's what I think.
Yeah, until Arthur Smith listens to this podcast and realizes that Chris Olave is the real wide receiver 1, and AJ Terrell lines up on Chris Olave and not Michael Thomas.
That'd be a problem. That'd be a problem indeed. All right, Dalton, your second sleeper.
So I was going to go Chris Olave, but since we talked about it, I did want to just provide someone else here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another player that he's just so low that I think he's going to hit. It's Kadarius Toney. So I'm going to give you the bad first, because there is a lot of bad that comes with Kadarius Toney, and it's not just being on the New York Giants, surprisingly. The first is he is absolutely not a good route runner in the NFL yet. Not good at it. When he runs anything that's not a slant or like a flat or a screen route, he does not separate. He's not good at those things. The good news is he is now in a coaching environment where the coaching staff will look at that and not use him that way. And more importantly,
coach him up to be able to do that, because he has all of the physical tools to be able to do it.
Correct. And
it's discipline.
The other thing is, even if he were good at those things, it wouldn't matter because his quarterback's not in Daniel Jones. What Daniel Jones is going to probably be asked to do is throw really short game manager-esque passes, which is where Kadarius Toney excels. Now, I'm not going to tell you he's going to be like a top 18 guy, but with an ADP of wide receiver 46 going 110th off the board, he's a bench wide receiver who I think is one of those guys you can stuff in your flex spot when you need him, and he has this really high boom potential. Last season, we all remember the game where he had like 8 targets and he went absolutely berserk. He was the second most efficient rookie on a yards per route run basis. He did play a lot more limited than other rookies, but to be second on that list still takes some work. It was 2 yards per route run, and we are correct in our assumptions when he came into this league that he is the best after the catch receiver out of his entire class. And as long as those skill sets are utilized, I'm okay with betting on that talent profile, despite the fact that he can't run routes, because that's something you can learn in the NFL. What you can't learn is being an absolute athletic freak like him.
We saw like the full Kadarius Toney experience last year in that Cowboys game that you mentioned. It was over 100 yards, and I think in back-to-back games he was like close to 200 total yards in those games, and that was like his stretch of the season, because other than that he was injured, or in the Cowboys game he went crazy, had a great day, and then got thrown out of the game for trying to punch a guy with the guy's helmet on. So you have some off the field and just kind of, I don't want to say character concerns, because I don't personally know Kadarius Toney quite obviously, but yes, but I'd say discipline is probably the thing with, again, some of the off the field stuff, and then just in the on the field stuff, the guy has all the physical chops to be able to do all of the stuff that a polished receiver would do. He just hasn't gotten to that point yet, and maybe he will. That and the injuries, because it seemed like he was hurt quite frequently last year, are the concerns. But I'm with you that he's one of the guys that when I get to that point in the draft, I look at, and he's one of my favorites in that range. You want to bet on on young guys who flashed in the previous year who are their value is suppressed for whatever reason. Maybe it was because they flashed, but they weren't consistent in year one, or it's because they're on a terrible team, or in the case of Kadarius Toney, it's both. So I think it's a fine bet to make as long as he doesn't work his way up to being like my last fantasy starter in drafts. As long as he doesn't become too mainstream, I'm fine with where he's at right now, though.
Yeah. Well, and what I will say is we knew he had character concerns coming into the NFL. That was something everybody knew out of Florida. And he landed in like the worst program other than Jacksonville to be in that in his rookie season. I mean, they had an entire brawl in the preseason. There was probably no leadership in that room because I do not think Daniel Jones is a leader. I don't think Kenny Galladay is a leader.
It was so bad last year that there was a fake tweet during training camp about how Joe Judge was making the whole team run laps because of something that happened, and I believed it because it was totally believable based on the other things we had seen about Joe Judge and about how that team was being run.
Yes. Well, and then even in the Cowboys game, because Robert Mays mentioned this on the Athletic Football Show, he was talking about it wasn't Tony's fault he got in a fight, and I got curious and I looked up the highlights. For like 12 straight plays, the Cowboys players are coming after Tony because he's just tearing the Cowboys up. And instead of like lining him up away from Trayvon Diggs for 2 plays, they just keep going back to Trayvon Diggs and causing more problems. And I know that's like a small thing, but like that's something a good coaching staff's not going to do if they know that this guy is going to do like a Michael Crabtree pull his chain and keep to leave kind of situation. And that's exactly what they did. Is they're like, oh, he's winning over there, just leave him over there. And they left him on an island until he lost his mind.
Okay, speaking of terrible coaches, we're going to go to a slightly better, but still I think pretty terrible coach in Matt Rule for my first breakout of this list. And he's the repeat that I mentioned earlier. I'm doing it again with DJ Moore. I said last year, this guy just has to catch more than 4 touchdowns, and he's going to crush where he's being drafted. And guess what he did? Exactly 4. He's like Alvin Kamara with the 81 catches for like 3 straight years. The dude is 4 touchdowns each of the last yards. 3 years. Yet between 1,100 and 1,200 every season. We've talked about this a little bit. Baker isn't a huge upgrade over Sam Darnold, but he is an upgrade, and he's at least league average. Like I think Baker is league average. Darnold is like a league average backup quarterback in the NFL. Baker has a 4.8% touchdown rate in his career. That I can guarantee you is much higher. I don't even have the Panthers' exact number, but because I remember from looking at it in the past, it is much higher than their touchdown percentage throwing the ball the last 2 years. I think they threw 17 passing touchdowns last year. So DJ Moore had 25% of the team's passing touchdown receptions last year. I think this is the year that he finally gets into that wide receiver 1 category. If his touchdowns just take a little bit of a leap, if the dude catches 7 or 8 touchdowns, like the yardage, I think is locked in. He's going to get that yardage, and there's still room for him as a player to develop, I think, too. For him as a player to develop and for the Panthers coaching staff to use him better. The latter I have less faith in than the former. His reception perception profile is very good at the short and intermediate patterns. Where it kind of trails off is the deep stuff. And if he could really become a better deep ball guy, that could unlock a new level for DJ Moore to get to. And then the other issue is the Panthers pretty much exclusively lined him up at the X receiver spot. They don't ever move him around. They never put him in motion, never have him run. Like as the way Matt Harmon put it, is they basically draw up no layups for this guy. No, just easy receptions. They can give him the ball and get to him in space, which is crazy because he's a great yards after the catch guy. I like DJ Moore this year. He didn't burn me last year, but he just did the same thing, and it felt bad to have picked him as a breakout last year. I think it's going to be better than that this year, and it's crazy that Baker Mayfield is the savior, but compared to what it's been, he feels like the savior.
Yeah, it is funny that we're doing this same bit with Terry McLaurin and Carson Wentz being his savior.
Yep.
I do actually think Baker's better than Carson, though, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
I think Baker does get a bad rep across the NFL because he plays hurt so frequently. I mean, his rookie year, he like legitimately was good for a quarterback.
Well, and he was good 2 years ago, and last year he like tore his rotator cuff of his non-throwing arm, but still tore his rotator cuff and was like barely. There was a game late in the season against the Steelers, I think, where it was like someone needs to sit this guy down. Like he's going to die out there. So I don't want to hold last year against him too bad. I do have some concerns if the offensive line is worse for Baker this year, which it should be. Like I don't think we can expect as good of a Baker Mayfield as we saw 2 years ago for the Browns, but again, it's still better than what the Panthers have had. And if that's the case, there's nothing about DJ Moore's game where you look at him and it's like that's why he does not score touchdowns. It's bad quarterback play and it's just flukiness.
Yeah, well, and another thing that's incredibly fluky, I know this off the top of my head because it's been all over Twitter, but over the last 3 seasons, the Panthers are the only team to have more rushing touchdowns than passing touchdowns. Really hard to do that. And if you remember,
that's because Sam Darnold and whoever Cam Newton and whoever else plays quarterback they score all of these read option touchdowns.
Well, and if you remember last year to start the season when the Panthers were 3-0, Sam Darnold was like QB8 for a while because they would get into the red zone and he's such a bad quarterback at making his reads. He would pull the ball and immediately run it in. And a good quarterback is going to stay in the pocket and throw to their best player. And I trust Baker at a very minimum to throw to DJ Moore in those situations. And then, I mean, this is a make it or break it year for Matt Rule. And if you're going to make it or break it, you're probably going to want to find the 2 best options on your offense in CMC and DJ Moore and sit Baker down and say, listen here, you're going to throw the ball to them. You're not going to stop.
You are literally my only hope because I have exercised too many resources on terrible quarterbacks. You have to be decent, Baker.
Exactly. So at the end of the day, I do think that DJ Moore is going to be a screaming value. It's just so hard with him. I'm just afraid that like maybe he's just always going to be that player. Like Julio doesn't score touchdowns. DJ Moore is 1,100 yards and 4 touchdowns.
Look, it's early, but Terrace Marshall was very uninspiring last year. Robbie Anderson changed how he spells his name. Big red flag for me going into this year.
He almost retired, and he hates his quarterback.
Almost retired. Said he hated Baker Mayfield. Said he didn't actually hate Baker Mayfield later on. He was just supporting Sam Darnold. And then, most importantly, changed the spelling of his name to the point of I don't remember which way is correct anymore, and that just makes me mad.
It does make me mad. Stop changing your name. Don't do it.
Okay, Dalton, your first breakout.
It's funny because our breakouts were wide receivers 18 and 17 last year, and mine was 17, so mine was actually one above yours. But I'm going with another guy who got a QB upgrade, and Michael Pittman Jr. This guy, I mean, last season he had 1,100 yards, 6 touchdowns. He had a really good season, and he had a quarterback in Carson Wentz who his team was doing everything they possibly could to get him to not throw the ball, and he still screwed it up as frequently as he could. I went to PFF and they had a comparison for him for his season last year. And that list includes A.J. Brown in 2020, Cortland Sutton in 2019, Michael Thomas, Des Bryant, Amari Cooper, Julio, Juju, and DJ Moore. That is an elite list of players to be a part of. And then you look at Matt Ryan's resume. And now his resume for these players is Roddy White, Julio Jones, and Calvin Ridley. I'm not going to put Michael Pittman Jr. in that echelon, but his wide.
I thought you were going to say, I'm not going to give Matt Ryan all the credit for those guys being good.
Well, no, but what Matt Ryan did is those guys over the course of Matt Ryan's career, his wide receiver 1 averaged 148 targets. That is just so much volume to go with it. The reports out of Colts camp have been moderately good. Paris Campbell might be the 2. Alec Pierce is looking like the guy, but they're also saying behind Michael Pittman Jr., there are a lot of drops going on. There's a lot of inconsistencies. Paris Campbell has not played more than 2 NFL games. So Michael Pittman Jr. can be the guy. I think that Frank Reich wants to throw the ball more. They don't want to make Jonathan Taylor rush the ball 28 times a game in his 3rd season.
Yeah, and he's literally said we leaned way more into the rushing than we want to. Number one, they should want to preserve Jonathan Taylor. And number 2, I think Frank Reich is smart enough to know we can win in the regular season doing that, but in the playoffs, that's just not a sustainable Super Bowl model. And when you keep trading for these veteran quarterbacks like they have year after year, they are gunning for the Super Bowl. And it's funny and unfortunate for them. This is still the fallout of the Andrew Luck retirement, because if Andrew Luck was the quarterback this whole time, then it would be a whole different story, because this roster is loaded and they should be thinking about trying to compete for the Super Bowl.
Yeah, well, it's absurd how loaded the entire rest of the roster is. And I mean, truthfully, Carson Wentz did prevent them from going to the playoffs in a layup game to beat the Jacksonville
He
Jaguars
did.
last year.
I will say I think Wentz gets a little bit of a bad rap for last year. Like you look at it on the whole, and he was like fine, not good, not terrible. The way it ended, yes, absolutely terrible. Was he a terrible person in the locker room and a terrible teammate to deal with? It clearly sounds like it.
Maybe.
So I think Matt Ryan is a clear upgrade, but I also it's not like they were playing with the worst quarterback in the league last year.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I'll say, and Matt Harmon absolutely loves Allen Robinson. So like loves Allen Robinson as much as he loves Terry McLaurin. And he compared Michael Pittman's first 2 seasons to Allen Robinson. And the thing that's bothering me is like a lot of people are pointing out that like Matt Ryan doesn't throw contested balls. I know Michael Pittman Jr. is tall, so anybody without a brain is like, oh, he's a jump ball receiver. He was like the 18th best separator in the NFL last year, and that's with Carson Wentz throwing him the deep balls. Like there was a highlight reel of Michael Pittman Jr. having comebacks to balls that were underthrown and beating the DB anyways. It's just going to work out so well. I think he's like one of those guys who could sneakily be a top 5 wide receiver to end the season. One of those, like long shot bets to lead the NFL in receiving yards.
Mm-hmm. If you guys can't tell, we are new subscribers of Reception Perception. So shout out Matt Harmon. That content is great. And we try and mention it as frequently as possible because it's helpful. It's a good place for us to find information. And we want to pass at least a little bit of it along to you, the listener. So, okay, Dalton, I'll get to my last breakout here. And this one, I literally had to go and redo my running back ranks just to move this guy up like 5 or 6 spots. And that's AJ Dillon. He might be the second best running back on his own team, but he is also the second best player, second best weapon, I should say, on this offense. We know 2 top 24 finishes are somewhat rare in fantasy football for running backs. 2 top 12 finishes are even more rare. But I think Dillon is a league winner type of guy going in that mid-round running back range. I think he's the RB 25 right now or 24. And that's about where I think he finished as the RB. I have it somewhere. RB 22, 23. He was somewhere in that range last year. So he's basically going exactly where he finished last year. He's going to be there between the tackles guy. Per PFF, he's gained at least 2 yards after contact per play, per rush, on a league high 75.5% of his carries since he entered the league 2 years ago. He's a better pass catcher than people think, than I would have thought, based on the fact that he looks like the Hulk and weighs like 250 pounds. Quadzilla, yeah. If Johnny, if you don't change his nickname to Quadzilla on Sleeper at some point soon, you're doing Sleeper wrong for your dynasty team. He had 34 receptions for over 300 yards last year, 4 games with over 40 yards. I've mentioned Aaron Jones as the guy who can line up as a receiver and run receiver routes and make plays down the field. And I completely still stand by that. And I think the fact that Aaron Jones can do that makes it so you can get these guys both on the field as often as possible. You can put Aaron Jones in the slot, you can put him out wide, and you can line them up both in the backfield in different creative ways. And it's really funny that this is where I got this note that I thought was interesting. But I was listening to Aaron Rodgers' Pardon My Take interview the other day, and they, for a split second, talked about real football and talked about the Packers offense. And he just talked that he is a West Coast offense guy. It's his favorite offense. But he did say that the good thing about the offense they have now is they put so many guys in motion. They can line up in the same look, and it means something different every time. And I think, to me, that just sounds like, oh, this is a really advantageous offense to use 2 running backs in creative ways. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out, how those guys are used. He led the team, AJ Dillon did last year, in carries. I think he's going to do it again by an even wider margin. He was like at 187 last year. I think you can probably hand him 30 more carries this year if he has a healthy season. They have no receivers ranked inside the top 40 of ADP last I checked. So I just think the second guy on this offense is going to be a very, very useful fantasy weapon. He has all the upside in the world if anything ever happened to Aaron Jones. And even if it doesn't, just looking back at last year, here we go. He was the RB 22 last year. he only had 5 rushing touchdowns. Think about it, between the tackles guy and a great offense. And Aaron Jones only had 4. So they had 9 rushing touchdowns between those two backs last year. You give him 4 more rushing touchdowns last year, he all of a sudden would have been the RB15, even with the exact same season last year. So I moved him up the RB17. I could totally see them having 2 top 12 backs this year, though.
Yeah, well, and you stole my thunder there because I'm going to write a way too bold takes for this fantasy season. I think one of them is going to be that A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones both finished in the top 12 and the first duo to do it since Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara did, because I think that's really within their outcomes. Like you said, I think Aaron Jones plays a lot more like receiver looks because they're going to need him to, and Aaron Rodgers is such a finicky quarterback that he wants guys out there who he knows exactly what they're going to do. And on the other side of that, this is probably a team that has like the second or third best defense in the NFL, and they're going to want to try to game clock manage if they're stuck in games where their receivers just aren't getting the job done, which I think is a very high possibility when you look at that receiver room.
Well, and both these backs, like I said, can get the job. I think Dillon can take a step forward in the passing game too this year.
Yeah.
Especially because they're going to need him to, probably.
Well, and if you get into the red zone, I mean, it's probably them and Robert Tonyan whenever he's back that you're looking at. A.J. Dillon is my favorite running back to take when I go no RB on underdog. It is such an easy thing to do. And then you stack him with a cheap Tonyan and a cheap Rodgers. It is incredible that the reigning MVP is being drafted as like the QB 14, and his entire offense, other than Aaron Jones, is like an afterthought to everybody.
I think he's moved up to QB 12 on Fantasy Pro, so people are starting to wise up to it a little bit, but still, yes.
Exactly. So I love it. Love A.J. Dillon. You can have 2 productive backs in a good offense, and this is a good offense. Don't shy away from it just because Aaron Jones is there, who I have in the top 5. So, it can work out for both of them.
Well, and just like look at some of the guys going in his range, like Antonio Gibson, J.K. Dobbins, even a little higher up, David Montgomery, who has allegedly been playing special teams at some point. Let me pull a couple other names. Travis Etienne, Elijah Mitchell, Josh Jacobs. I think A.J. Dillon, even though he's not the starter on his own team, is safer than all of those guys and offers a very similar ceiling.
Is Josh Jacobs the starter?
I think Dobbins still has slightly more upside, but the upside is not all that dissimilar between those two.
Yeah.
And the floor is safer.
Absolutely. I mean, he's healthy, most importantly. And then again, like, it isn't good to take like the best handcuffs in football. That's why Tony Pollard is like running back 28 in ADP. And I mean, that room behind Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon gets really slim. It's like Kylan Hill and some other guys. There's no one else really there to do it. There's no Ty Montgomery in that offense anymore. So if A.J. Dillon gets hurt, which he is an older back, you have like immediate like top.
You mean Aaron Jones? Aaron Jones.
Sorry, Aaron Jones. Yes.
It's funny you mentioned Tony Pollard. I really badly wanted to put him on this list, but the Cowboys are one of the few teams when the owner comes out and says it's got to all revolve around Zeke, just like, God damn it, man, just let it happen. So I couldn't put Pollard on this list. Can't wait to one day be able to do so.
Just as like an aside, you know what has cracked me up? Memphis has produced like some of the most tantalizing NFL backs.
Yeah.
Between Gibson, Kenneth Gainwell, and Tony Pollard, it's like, why can't one of them just be a starter so I can actually know that Memphis is actually producing these guys and they're not just putting names out there that look good on film?
Did you mention Darrell Henderson too?
Oh, Darrell Henderson's another one. They all look good.
And Kenneth Gainwell.
I did say Gainwell, but
also from Memphis. Yep.
It's so annoying. Memphis is just, they're just tricksters with how they use those running backs, I feel like.
Yeah, they are all hybrid receiver types when they come in. And Antonio Gibson was like quite literally a receiver at Memphis.
And now he's a rusher.
So that's why that's been a weird path for him. Okay, Dalton, your last breakout, our last guy of the show is?
Well, it was spoiled. Thanks for that one, Evan.
I forgot.
But it's Trey Lance, who's currently going as the QB 13. A podcast host who will not be named, but he's a host for a podcast that rhymes with the Schmanishi Schmutballers, famously ranked Trey Lance in the top 5 when he wasn't even a starter last year. And I went and looked at that same podcast host ranks this year, and he has him as 9. I don't know how you get that like leap of faith and then lose it when this guy is actually the bona fide starter.
He
this
played
year.
like 1 or 2 games last year, and to be honest, he didn't look very good. But it was like replacing an injured Jimmy G. Didn't have more than a couple days to prepare, and you know what? It was his first game. It was like 1 or 2 games as a rookie.
Well, and it doesn't matter if he didn't look good, because when it comes to, and this is a trend that I'm now on year 3 on.
Yeah, tell me how many rushes he had against the Texans last year.
It was the Cardinals. He had 16 carries against the Cardinals for 89 yards. That's 8.9 fantasy points. It's so hard to get that as a quarterback. In games he started, which is 3, he came close to an average of 8 rushes per game, which would have been the highest for any quarterback in the NFL. Then you just like go to his supporting cast in Debo, in Ayuk, in Kittle, and that offensive line with Trent Williams anchoring it. It is so hard for you to come up with a scenario where he does not return like a top 10 value, because his best trait is he's a runner. Just like Jalen Hurts didn't look great as a passer last year, but because he could rush the ball so effectively, the guy just gets it done.
He has one thing that Hurts does not have, though, and that's a cannon arm. He has a huge arm.
And I just don't get like the QB 13 vibes here. I would rather take Trey Lance at ADP than I would take like Jalen Hurts.
And wow, then, like, you're the first person I've heard that from all week. That's crazy.
Well, I mean, like if you're building like an ideal fantasy team, you want to hit on the late round guy, and he is like him and maybe Kirk Cousins are the only late round guys who could creep into the top 12. And like, are we really excited about taking Dak Prescott at 10 with like no one in that team and like a bad offensive line? Would you be surprised if at the end of the season, Dak Prescott's like QB 13 and Trey Lance is QB 6 with 9 rushing touchdowns?
No, not at all. And the thing with Trey Lance is that he's so cheap. What is like QB 13, I think, right now, which, to be frank, I think I have him at QB 15. I think I need to move him up a little bit. It's hard to get him inside the top 12 because there's a lot of good quarterbacks. But at the same time, if I'm drafting a quarterback late, I'm kind of ignoring that rank a little bit, and I'm shooting for upside, because if it misses, guess what I can do? I can go pick up Kirk Cousins. I can go pick up Matt Ryan. I can correct the mistake quite easily. It's kind of like with tight ends, how we talked about with Irv Smith last week with his injury. If he doesn't play week 1, you can go correct that mistake quite easily if things don't work out, if he doesn't play or he stinks for a couple weeks.
Yeah. And if it works out, and I hate this comparison, but there are beat writers for The Athletic going out there and being like, this is like Mahomes all over again. Like, this is a guy that sat a year out, and we're seeing him make these highlight plays every practice. Mm-hmm. And if it works out and he comes in and Shanahan's like, I finally got the one guy that is like capable of running this zone read offense to a T, then he could be like a QB1. Like, out of everybody outside like the top 8 QBs, he's probably the only guy who has that upside, except for maybe Daniel Jones. If Brian Dabble is like the QB whisperer that we all have been waiting for.
I do want to address this before we move on too quick. Noah asked, the Cowboys basically asked, do the Cowboys have bad offensive line? The answer to that is not bad, but aging and getting worse by the year. They just lost Lyle Collins to the Bengals,
lost their best tackle.
Yeah, their best their left tackle, I believe.
Yeah, and Frederick is getting. I mean, Frederick didn't play a full season. They brought Zion Williamson in to be like their guard, and there's concerns about him being ready.
Wait,
not Zion Williamson.
Look, I know Zion Williamson's a pretty hefty man, but you got to get a little weight to be a guard.
They traded the Pelicans. They gave the Pelicans Michael Gallup. No, they brought in a guard in the draft though, and even then, there's concerns that he's not going to be ready to play. So yeah, I would say they don't have a great offensive line.
It's just not it. Like, they used to be elite, and now they're probably middle of the pack. That's what I'd say. But
it's like what happened to Joe Flacco.
The last thing I would say about him is we've got to give Kyle Shanahan, for as much as he frustrates us from a fantasy perspective, this guy not only traded up into the top 3, top 4, whatever pick he was, to take him, but was totally good with. I know Jimmy G was not good last year. They still almost made the Super Bowl with him at quarterback, and they were fine being like, okay, bye, it's Trey Lance time this year, like, no doubt about it. So I think that has to factor into that until we actually see it, because we've barely seen it with Trey Lance. We have to think that Shanahan's not crazy in seeing something in this kid.
Yeah, I mean, he made Matt Ryan the best. I mean, Matt Ryan won an MVP. I'm not going to say because of Kyle Shanahan, but like Kyle Shanahan was a very critical part to him winning MVP because he has not replicated that performance since. And it's just, you get like Andy Reid picked Mahomes and it worked out. And just like that, this coach picked his player and they're probably going to do their damnedest to work it out. And when two offensive minds meld and two skill sets meld, they just like could next year we be talking about Trey Lance being like the QB4 behind like
Yeah.
the three elite, you know?
Yeah. Like, who, like, after that top three, it's Herbert and Kyler. Like,
Yeah.
looking ahead the next year, it's like, yeah, maybe he doesn't pass Herbert. Depends on what the rushing upside truly is, but he could easily be right there in that 5 through 8 conversation. Yeah. Eventually, Tom Brady is not going to be there. Eventually, but he still is right now.
Yeah, and of course, we are just putting Jalen Hurts in the 4 because this will be the season he just gets incredible. So maybe 5, but still.
I just gotta say, I love that you have Lance as your guy because he's like if you made Jalen Hurts an actual good prospect.
Well, that's just offensive. Like, I will say, my last note on Trey Lance is like he does fit the type of football player I like to watch. Like he's this deep cannon, like I don't care thrower. Like I was watching Christian Watson highlights trying to figure out if I liked him, and all of his highlights are like Trey Lance just like throwing it down against like these cruddy little corners and like Christian Watson going up and getting it. Yep. It is a very fun player. He does have a cannon. He just needs to fix everything that's not 40 yards downfield.
Yeah, it's so funny that 2 of the most athletic freaks in the NFL right now, young guys, went to North Dakota State to play their college football. And on that note, that is going to do it for episode 77 of the Half Point Per Podcast. Thank you to everyone who listens, to everyone in the YouTube chat and watching on YouTube tonight. We appreciate you guys very much. Subscribe to the YouTube at Half Point Per Pod. Follow the TikTok at Half Point Per Pod as well. That is probably the 2 biggest things you can do to support the podcast right now. Read the newsletter at halfpointperpod.substack.com. And of course, listen to us anywhere you find your podcast, Spotify, Apple, etc. Leave us the 5-star reviews. Those are always appreciated as well. And we will talk to you guys next week with, I believe, Bus. So another big show coming up. Thank you guys so much again for listening.